have this. First off, I want to again, thank everyone for joining. Yeah, I know y'all have busy schedules, with finals and everything around the corner. And so, with that, today's topic, we're gonna hopefully be having a good discussion today. My goal is to provide you with some basic foundational level knowledge regarding the topic of boredom versus laziness and knowing the difference, but more so, keeping our mental engine running. When we are experiencing these droughts or cycles or ruts of like boredom or laziness, how do we keep it going, right? How do we get out of that cycle? And so I hope for today that our conversation could provide some helpful knowledge and some skills regarding that topic. Um, Again, my name is Gilbert Lopez. I'm one of the clinicians at the Texas State Counseling Center. For those who are interested, whether it's this topic or any other areas of concern, you could always give our office a call or visit us to get an appointment set up. We are located on the fifth floor of the LBJ Student Center building. And towards the end of the program, I will have some contact info, just if any of y'all are curious. All righty, so we'll go ahead and jump in and get this thing going. So just a bit of an agenda, just to kind of keep track of what we're going to be discussing. And so we already went over the introduction, but really, identifying and focusing on that topic of boredom versus laziness. I understand, everyone who's here today might have some history or some background, something that sparked that interest to join us today. So hopefully, please feel free to add questions. And so getting into that questions, if you do have any questions during this PowerPoint, I'm going to try to be very fluid and flexible to answer those, but just make sure to use the Q&A function. Again, if you have any questions, to use the Q&A function. The next part of this program, after we have a discussion on the topic, is the keeping the mental engine running. How do we do that? How do we get out of these feelings of kind of being like stuck? And so I always use that analogy of like an engine. Us as individuals, our body's like a machine. So we need to keep it running. We need to keep it going. But it's important that we implement strategies and skills that don't burn us out, that don't contribute to that cycle of maybe laziness or boredom, that we're able to get out of that rut and do so in a way with skills that could be transferable to the rest of your life. And then towards the end, as I mentioned, I will provide some basic information, on services within our office, if anyone is interested, but also, some basic contact info for those who are interested. Go on to the next slide. And so, boredom versus laziness. What's the difference, right? It's important that we do identify the difference, because depending on what we're experiencing, we're going to approach it differently. And so it's really important that we do know and how to differentiate the two. The concept of boredom, the concept of laziness, right? Just me saying those words, right? I'm pretty sure there's some things that pop up internally. And so for those who are in attendance, if you don't mind using the Q&A function, what are some of those things that make boredom versus laziness different? Like, what is your insight as far as what boredom and laziness is? And so feel free to, put in a response in the Q&A, and I'll give y'all about 30 seconds just to kind of maybe jot down something. Anything that comes up regarding the concept of what laziness is or what boredom is. Give y'all about 30 seconds. And remember to utilize the Q&A box. Okay. So one of the responses I got was, bored is maybe like nothing to do, nothing really to kind of get you going, versus lazy is maybe there's lots of things to do, but being worn out, maybe being stretched thin. Um, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that response. Great. And those aren't too far as both of these concepts, as we're about to dive into more. Okay, so boredom, um, it's a state of weariness or dissatisfaction resulting from a lack of stimuli in our environment. It is generally considered to be one of the least desirable conditions of daily life. And so I pulled this definition from the American Psychological Association. And so with boredom, and I think this is key, it's the lack of stimuli in our environment. The absence of something that has been assigned to us or a task. And so there's nothing there to motivate us, to drive us. It's actually a period of maybe there might be nothing to do. And that's important that we identify that boredom isn't really our sense of like not wanting to be productive, but being in a sense of, okay, there's really nothing to do. And so it's important to note that because we don't want to internalize some of these things. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. And so this next slide, I use this slide quite a bit. It kind of it shows the effects of how performance and stress, which here is listed as arousal, affect our performance, right? The things we get done. And so we look at the left end of the bell curve where it's low. It's kind of in that yellow area where there's fatigue, sleepiness. That's where boredom is located. There's not any arousal. There's no stimuli. And so we tend to be bored, right? That's where boredom is. There's nothing to do, nothing that catches our attention or interest. And so with boredom, and I share this, is that boredom at times is natural. It's okay that we are bored sometimes, because sometimes we get all of our homework done. We're off that day. There's nothing to do. And so it's okay to use that boredom, but it's all about how we interpret that boredom and that we don't mistakenly identify it as laziness. I've seen quite a bit that, that one day that we have nothing to do, turns out that we feel like, oh, we're not doing enough, right? Especially in school, right? There's always homework, there's things to get done. But when there's nothing to do, we might internalize that as not being productive. And then that could become a very slippery slope of getting confused as far as is boredom or is this laziness. And so for this example, right, if we have everything done on our task list, there's nothing in our environment to increase our attention or interest, then we're going to feel bored. And it's during those moments of boredom that could be really useful, whether it's to rest, relax, kind of recoup, become creative, right? That's where creativity and imagination comes, is sparked at, is when we're bored, right? We kind of look inside self and we try to find ways to be creative or to pique our own interest. And so boredom is healthy at times. And it's good that we do feel bored time to time, because that kind of tells us like we don't want to overdo our day-to-day task list, right? We don't want to overdo it, because when we overdo it, that might lead to like burnout, chronic stress, increased anxiety. And so, boredom's okay. And so how does boredom, pop up, right? What it might look like. So as far as, psychological arousal, boredom only occurs when, we're psychologically energetic and would like to engage in something, but we don't have anything to do. And so the intent is there for us wanting to be productive and to get things done, but there's nothing to get done. There's nothing in our environment. Another way boredom could pop up is maybe our environment is too busy, and that could impact or impair our focus and our attention. And so an overabundance of stimuli can be overwhelming to some individuals. We kind of get into that overload, which might lead us to withdraw, to disengage, and then again, feel bored at the end of it. Lack of control. So the less control we might have over a situation, the greater the likelihood of boredom. On the other hand, if you feel like you can impact your environment in the moment, then you'll often find yourself getting absorbed by the task at hand in that moment. And so in those situations where we might feel like, oh, we don't have much control of what's going on here, then we might check ourselves out in a sense of then we start to become bored. And that might happen in the classroom at times. There could be a lecture. It might be something we already know, something that doesn't pique our interest. And then we kind of maybe daydream or kind of veer off and we think about what we need to do tomorrow. But if we're able to get some sense of control and maybe develop some task in the moment, then that would pique our interest and get us back on track. Other ways boredom could present itself is maybe some reminders from past boredom. So an example of that is, if you were disinterested in history class in grade school, right? And so in the future, whenever you see a history book or a history class, you might automatically feel bored, right? And so it's that reminder of past boredom. And so that could be very helpful to, maybe do some self-reflections, what in the past has maybe not interested you as much? And if so, maybe either trying to regain interest in those topics or situations, or come up with a plan where if you are in those moments that you do have some type of task at hand to help you stay engaged, even though the topic itself might not be as interesting. And so that helps, again, right, bring in control of the situation. All right. Laziness. Before I get into laziness, any questions regarding boredom, maybe some of the information that I shared? Again, remember to use the Q&A function. All right, we'll keep on going. And so the second part of this, right, laziness. We've talked about what boredom is, how it pops up, what it looks like. Now let's do laziness. And so laziness is having or showing the unwillingness to work. If motivation to spare effort trumps motivation to do the right or expected thing. And so the biggest thing about laziness is that the intent behind it, right? The unwillingness to work. If it's gonna cause more effort for me to do what is expected versus not do it at all, then I'm not gonna do it, right? And so that's, I think, one of the key differences between the two. Laziness, no intention, unwillingness to work, get things done, boredom, the absence of stimuli, maybe nothing to do. And you can see how, if we're able to differentiate the two, how it might impact us differently at the end of it, right? Because if we get the two flipped or we get them confused or switched with each other, we might start to internalize ourselves as being lazy, but when we're actually really just bored, you got everything done. And so the way laziness could present itself, so psychologically, feeling depressed, feeling hopeless and low energy. This can disrupt the concept of our own self-worth and our own values, could lead to feeling ashamed or even belittling ourselves, right? So if we begin to identify as someone who is lazy or someone who, isn't being productive with the time that we have, especially with all the things that are on our to-do list already. This could definitely, again, disrupt our concept of how we see ourselves. And so if this is something that, you know, pops up and we identify this as laziness, okay, well then we're going to address this differently than if it was boredom. But if we're experiencing boredom, but we're defining it as laziness, that could cause some trouble there, right? And so again, with laziness, another way it could present itself is that it might be painful to expend effort. It could be exhausting, to expend effort on long-term goals that do not provide immediate gratification, right? So we might get swept with the big to-do list, the things we have to do in the bigger picture that we might dismiss or not complete the small things that we need to complete in order to reach those long-term or bigger goals. And that could be detrimental. For example, I've been using academics as an example. You know, our goal is to graduate, get a degree. But in order to do that, we need to pass our classes every semester. But in order to pass our classes, we have to pass our exams, our projects, turn in assignments. And so those are the smaller goals that contribute to that bigger goal, right? Graduation. And so if we catch ourselves finding it, being, dreadful or exhausting, to expend effort on some of these goals because they don't provide immediate gratification, then that could cause some disruptions in our goals, right? That could cause disruption in our classes, the grades that we get, the way we study, the way we approach things. Another way laziness also, affects an individual is it affects us as lowering our drive, that sense of purpose, right? We all have our purpose and reasons for coming to a university to pursue a degree, right? And so that laziness could hinder that. An underabundance of environmental stimuli, or not having developed goals, or maybe feeling no purpose, or even a low sense of life satisfaction, right? We're not feeling as happy. We're feeling like we're not being fulfilled. Laziness could affect that and really exacerbate it, make it like 0 to 100. And so, these are some of the ways laziness affects us. And you can see how laziness affects us versus the boredom, right? And now that we've kind of talked about how they present themselves, the differences in our day-to-day lives, now it's important to know, like, okay, what are we truly experiencing? Because once we're able to identify what we're truly experiencing, then we're able to problem solve, find solutions to it. And so the impact of both of these, right? So laziness and boredom, together could form that cycle that could disrupt your drive, your motivation. It could impact you on completing, your daily obligations. But not only obligations, but disrupting social relationships, whether it's hanging out with friends, planning a trip to go back to see family for the weekend. If we're caught in that cycle of laziness, then we might not do those things. And if we don't see family for X amount of time, if we're flaking on friends, then that's going to affect your relationships. And so it's very detrimental to identify that. Academic role confusion, right? Feeling inadequate and shame, using those negative self-statements, right? I'm not a good student, or I'm wasting time. And so this might appear in a declining grades for maybe the first time. And so really paying attention to, not only is it affecting my drive, my obligations, but it's starting to affect my academics. And then once we get caught in that, right, we get into that low productivity. Once we are stuck in that cycle, we might not be as productive. Or if we are productive and if we are completing things, then it might be poor quality work. And so it's very key to be mindful of some of these ramifications. And if these are something that you're experienced, right, to reach out for support, reach out for help, or even use some of the information or the skills that we're about to review in the second half of this PowerPoint. Okay. And so any questions, again, making some time for that. And if you do have any questions, use the Q&A function. Give maybe about 15 to 20 seconds this time if you want to jot anything down. Okie dokie. And so with that, right, now let's get to the part where we start to talk about like, okay, how do we approach this, right? We've talked about what it looks like, what it can cause, how it can affect a person, but what do we do, right? And so the approach. And so, as I mentioned, it's very important to identify, are we approaching it from the stance of boredom, or are we approaching it from the stance of, is this laziness, right? If it's boredom, it's something that is the result of a lack of maybe tasks or things to do. If so, then we could identify tasks, identify ways we could increase that sense of energy in the moment. If this is laziness, then this is something a little bit more deeper, right? It's that unwillingness, the drive isn't there. We don't want to expend that effort into completing our goals. So we're making an intentional decision not to. And so with that requires, some support, maybe doubling down on some of these coping skills we're about to review in a second. And so the first question I ask you, and this will be more of a self-reflection question. If you've been in these kind of cycles or these ruts, as some students have described them to me, think a second. Is this more of the boredom or is this more of laziness? And kind of just think about that for a second, especially as we approach the coping skills. Okay. So as part of the coping skills, keeping the mental engine running, a lot of it is deeply rooted in self-care. And so with self-care, everyone has their own concept or definition of what self-care is. The way I describe self-care is it is self-maintenance. Some people confuse self-care with like self-indulgence, like, oh, hobbies, if I have time, I'll get to it. But no, self-care is we're making an intentional effort to set us up for success. I use an example of a car. The difference when we take our car to the mechanic to get an oil change versus new window tint or new paint, right? We want to provide that maintenance because our bodies themselves are machines. We need to keep it running, but not to an extent to where it burns out. Okay. And so the first category of skill setting is goal setting. With both laziness and boredom, right? We talked about how there might be an absence of task or goals, or if there is task or goals, we don't want to expend the energy, right? And laziness. So we want to break it down to where it is attainable and manageable. So identifying, what your goals are. Are they manageable? Are they attainable? Are they realistic? Again, we don't want to get caught up in the big goal of we need to graduate, right? Because just picture it, like if you came to school on day one at Texas State, you're a freshman. The goal is I need to pass, I need to do what I need to do, I need to graduate. But when you look at it, that goal is maybe 4 or 5 years down the road. So what can we do in the moment to help reach that goal? Because looking 4 or 5 years down the road, that could be a little overwhelming. And so we want to break it down. We want to focus like, okay, that is my overall goal to get a degree. But to break that down into smaller, my more manageable goal is I need to pass this semester. More so, I need to pass these classes. I need to pass this exam in this class. And so really breaking it down and making sure that your goals are attainable. Um, don't expect perfect. We are all humans. People are not designed to be perfect. There is no such thing as perfect. When we get caught up in trying to be perfect, then we kind of lose sight of the progress, the work, the grind it takes to get that goal done, right? Because when we think of perfect, we kind of think of like the finished end product, right? What does it look like at the finish line, right? This is what I need to do. But in order to get there, to get to the finish line, we still have to run the race. And so that's where shifting our mindset from perfect to progress. And so don't expect perfect, but just really focus on the progress, which is those small attainable goals. Um, get organized, prioritize your task list. See what is priority, see what is due this week versus what is due in a couple of weeks, and get it listed on a planner. Our brain loves routine. Our brain loves to be organized. And so if we're able to list what we need to get done days in advance, well, it gives us an opportunity to prepare for it, right? It's more manageable to review and prepare for our day than kind of taking it day by day. And don't get me wrong, some people are able to do that, but it can be pretty overwhelming, kind of going that day by day, assignment by assignment, versus if we're able to get organized and give our chance to prepare ourselves for it. Another one is, ask for help. Asking for help at times could be viewed as, we're not doing what we need to do, or it's a sign of weakness, but asking for help is important. We can't get everything done. We don't know everything. Me as a professional, I still ask for help on things. It's very important. That's how you build connections, right, with your peers. And so asking for help. Avoid distractions. The biggest distraction probably out there is our phone, right? And so when you're setting goals, or when you're, in those ruts of, laziness, we don't want to use our phone or any other distraction as like a scapegoat, right? Because we might be in the moment where we're just lazy, and then we get on our phone, and then before you know it, a day flies by or an afternoon flies by. And so getting on our phone might provide that temporary relief, right? We don't want to worry about what we're worrying about. But at the end of the day, what needs to get done still needs to get done. And so we want to make sure we're avoiding distractions. Make tedious tasks fun, right? So if you have to do something on your to-do list that is, again, tedious, maybe not the most desirable experience, find ways to make it fun, right? If you're cleaning your room, put on some music, blast some music, rearrange your room, do something that helps spark that creativity, right? That imagination. Because again, if this is boredom, right? There's that lack of that, the lack of, stimuli. So if we begin to engage in tasks that spark our creativity or imagination, then that's going to help get us out of that boredom cycle as well. And so all of these goals are transferable for both boredom and laziness. But just depending on what you're addressing, we might need to take a more specific angle to it. The next one is healthy living, right? So again, if we view our body as a machine, we need to make sure that we're providing the proper fuel, right? We're staying hydrated. So implementing a well-balanced, healthy diet. I completely understand, right? As a university student, fast food is typically the easiest, right? And sometimes we like, that Chick-fil-A, but making sure we're having a more balanced diet. That, we do have some days where we do cook, that we do have more of a balance of what we're consuming regarding greens, grains, but also staying hydrated. Having a water bottle on hand. It's something that I practice regularly. Just having something on hand to stay hydrated. Exercise. Um, you know, on campus, it's like we walk everywhere and all these hills. So in a way, that is kind of exercise. But making some time for exercise activities that you enjoy, whether it's swimming, hiking, if it's running or weightlifting, some type of physical exercise or activity could be very beneficial. Getting sleep and rest, so making sure that we are having a good sleep routine, that we have a set bedtime, that we have a set wake up time, because again, our brain loves routine, and creating this new cycle of a more positive, healthy routine will help us get out of those cycles of like laziness and boredom. Um, and then by doing this, we all are able to manage our stress levels. Um, stress is something that affects everybody. It's we get stressed out from an exam. I get stressed out getting caught in traffic, right? It happens. There's no way we're going to avoid stress. Um, you know, some things that I implement in my own life as far as reducing stress is the exercise. I also love to cook, so making some time on the weekends to really just focus on things that make me happy, that make me feel productive, right? Because for those who have either exercised or cooked or maybe painted before, how do you feel after that product is completed? You feel fulfilled, right? That sense of purpose. You feel good about it. And so doing things that are penciled in your calendar for self-care, to target that stress. And so, exercise, cooking, staying hydrated are just some of the things I do personally. And a lot of students do. A lot of students have reported, just taking care of our body makes such a big impact, not only on our physical health, but our mental health as well. Okay. And then staying positive. And I think this is really, really key. We want to implement positive self-talk. And I think this is something that kind of really directly, addresses the laziness, right? Because as I mentioned, with laziness, we might get caught up in that negative viewpoint. We don't want to expend effort. That might create this negative self-talk that, as I listed, maybe, as some examples, I can't get this done, it's too much. And so instead of imposing that negative self-talk, we should impose that positive reframe, right? So for the example, I can't get this done, it's too much, right? Just that statement sounds pretty heavy, right? It sounds overbearing. It sounds like the goal is overarching. We can't get to it. But if we're able to spin that and use a more positive reframe, such as, okay, this is important, and I will take as much time as I need to get this done, right? And so at the end of it, both of those statements are kind of coming to the same conclusion, but we're just expressing it differently. The first one is very heavy, very internalizing, right? Like I'm doing something wrong. The second one is, okay, this is important to me, right? That stress. But, I'll take as much time as I need to get this done. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so, really paying attention to what is that narrative we're telling ourselves, right? Because sometimes if that narrative is negative, it might keep us in that laziness rut or that laziness cycle because we begin to believe it, right? We don't want to fall into those traps. We want to acknowledge the thought and be like, okay, that was the thought, but let me reframe it, okay? We want to build upon our strengths. And so with building upon our strengths, we want to identify, what are we good at? Right? What do we feel confident in doing? And so if so, to use our strengths to get out of that boredom, right? If we're feeling bored and there's nothing to do that day, well, let me rely on some of my strengths. Let's see what I can get done. Or if we're in that laziness rut, okay, identifying that, okay, there's been some cycles of laziness, but how can I build upon my strengths to help get me out of this? Also, it's very important that we recognize our accomplishments along the way. Give yourself a pat on the back, pretty much, right? Um, you know, it's as I mentioned earlier, it's important that we create these small attainable tasks from that bigger goal, but we want to make sure that we're accomplishing when we complete those small attainable tasks. Because even though they might be more smaller and attainable, doesn't mean they're all easy, right? And so celebrating that, giving yourself a space to highlight what you're getting done. Because it goes back to also that don't expect perfect, right? We want to we want to identify and validate the progress versus just visualizing that perfect product, because it takes progress to finish that product, right? And so again, celebrating your accomplishments, rewarding yourself. If you get something done, go celebrate, right? Go for a swim, go to your favorite restaurant, go spend time with friends. Um, you know, really, rewarding your efforts. Because when we reward our efforts, then we're more inclined to continue to expend that effort, right? As I kind of mentioned with laziness, right? The effort not to do anything outweighs the value as if we were to do something. So we add our own value to it and we reward ourselves, then we're going to be naturally inclined to follow through and get things done. Another helpful strategy is maybe developing your own mantra. A mantra, for those who are not familiar, is like a one statement, a one-liner that helps us stay grounded in the moment. Helps us stay grounded in the moment to where we don't get caught up in maybe some of that negative self-talk. We don't get caught up in that negative ruts, right? And so sometimes mantras could be a couple of words long. And so an example would be like, stay moving, just finish, right? And the thing about, laziness, we don't expend that effort, right? But if we just move and we just get it done, we might not feel like we want to get things done, right? We might not feel 100%, but if we just get it done, it's going to build that motivation and that momentum that could help keep our mental engine running. And so with mantras, it could be helpful to listen to music, identify a song, okay? And so this is just a clip from the All American Rejects, Move Along. So this is a song that came out back in the day for some of you. And don't hate, yes, this was our style back in the early 2000s. And so using a song could help us stay grounded.
When all you gotta keep is strong, move along like I know you do. And even when your hope is gone, move along just to make it through. When all you gotta keep is strong, move along like I know you do. And even when your hope is gone, move along just to make it through. When all you gotta keep is strong, move along like I know you do. And even when your hope is gone, move along just to make it through.
And so with that, that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar today. Again, that's just an example of how using a song can be used also as a mantra to kind of help us stay grounded in those moments where we feel like we don't want to do anything, right? Whether it's the boredom or the laziness, and it kind of helps us, get going, right? And so with all that being said, I'm going to definitely make some time for any questions. And so if you have any final questions, please put them in the Q&A, as we do have some time for that. And so a question that popped up was, how I manage stress. From this PowerPoint, you can see that I listen to music. Music is a good question, or a good way to cope with the stress. Music I feel like allows us to allow our emotions to be validated and spoken. And so music, and also I mentioned, working out, staying hydrated, being organized, that really helps manage stress. Because again, we're not going to get rid of stress, but we could definitely help better be prepared for it. Any other questions? I'll give a couple more moments. Alrighty. And so as we come to the end of our presentation, again, thank you everyone for making some time out of your busy schedules to spend with us as we have this discussion of boredom versus laziness, but how to keep the mental engine running. Good luck on finals, and if you have any questions, I will stick around for a bit. But that's all we have today. Thank you and take care.